Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Some sneaky, but I think fascinating news coming out for this Colorado program Thursday afternoon. Former Michigan linebackers coach George Hilo expected to join this Colorado staff heading into 2024. Now, many of you guys know I'm a Michigan fan, very familiar with George Hilo, and I look at this hire and say, this makes a ton of sense. And to some of the Michigan fans that might be listening to this as well, we go back to George Hilo at Michigan in 2021 and 2022 when he was coaching the linebackers. We saw significant development in that linebacker room, right? Junior Colson, true freshman All-American. You look at Mikey Barrett, consistently got better under George Hilo. I think the bigger reason that George Hilo and Michigan decided to part ways after the 2022 season, I think George Hilo might have been looking for some more opportunities, but I think more importantly, wasn't necessarily the best recruiter on the recruiting trail. I think that's why they brought Chris Partridge in. But as a pure football coach, I think this makes a ton of sense for Colorado where, okay, we have some question marks about George Hilo and what he does on the recruiting trail. We ain't got no question marks about what he is as a football coach, developing players specifically in that linebacker room, which was a problem for Colorado in 2023. And so you look at George Hilo coming into Colorado, we don't have question marks about him recruiting. That's going to be taken care of by other members of the staff. But in this era of college football where you can have as many on-field coaches as you want, just stack good coaches. And that's something that Coach Prime has done a really nice job of. A lot of the conversation goes to what he's done in the transfer portal, how he's turned around this team from a talent standpoint. I think there's been some sneaky good hires that Colorado has had during this offseason. I think George Hilo is one of those kind of guys. Want to get into George Hilo, talk a little bit about his background, what to expect and his impact within this Colorado defense. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys. And it's really been a blast covering all of these offseason stories and the amount of support y'all have shown the fellas. It means the absolute world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into George Hilo, and let's start with just his background. He's been at programs like Florida State, like Alabama, like Georgia, and I think the biggest thing you take away from that is he's been around some of the best defensive minds we've seen in the college football landscape for the last couple of decades, right? Kirby Smart, both at Alabama and at Georgia. He worked under Kirby Smart as an intern at Alabama when Kirby Smart was the defensive coordinator, and then worked under Kirby Smart as a head coach at Georgia a little bit later on. Obviously, also working under a guy like Nick Saban. When you can find coaches that have been around greatness, specifically on the defensive side of the football, you want to bring those guys in. George Hilo's been around greatness. You talk about George Hilo, he's been on two staffs that have won national championships. Florida State in 2013, Alabama in 2012. And so he's been around elite defenses. He's been around elite coaches. He knows what it looks like to coach at an extremely high level. So you look at George Hilo's background and say, it's very intriguing. He's been a guy that has consistently moved up the ranks, right? Graduate assistant to linebackers coach at Maryland and then to Michigan. This is a guy that I think has been a really good football coach during his career over the last about a decade. I think this makes a lot of sense for Colorado. Now, you talk about what the impact George Hilo might have within this Colorado defense. I think you first look at that linebacker position. A guy, Nikhil Green, who's going to be a Colorado linebacker in 2024, a guy that I thought was kind of a sneaky addition that Colorado made. Really good relationship with George Hilo. Obviously, they worked together when Nikhil Green and George Hilo were back at Michigan. We look at this Colorado linebacker room, and it was, I wouldn't say a disaster last year, but it certainly wasn't good, right? At one point, you were moving Trevor Woods from safety to linebacker. They were just kind of filling it in as it went along. We expect this linebacker room from a talent standpoint to get a lot better, but you bring in a guy like George Hilo, who again has been on a Michigan staff that I thought did a really nice job in terms of linebacker development. That's probably the biggest impact that you're going to get from George Hilo, but also just being around the defensive minds that he's been around. I think he's going to rub off on a relatively young defensive coordinator in Robert Livingston. Getting a guy in George Hilo who's been around greatness on the defensive side of the football, that's only going to help Robert Livingston be a really good defensive coordinator for this Colorado program in the 2024 season. To me, I think, again, it's a sneaky hire that might not garner a ton of national media attention like normally Coach Prime does. That being said, I think this makes a lot of sense because at the end of the day, you have unlimited on-field coaches. You fill your staff up with guys who've been really good football coaches. I think George Hilo is one of those guys. So to me, it's going to be a move that flies under the radar, but I think makes a ton of sense for this Colorado program. We'll cut it there. Again, appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.